Welcome to Bricklayer. In this video, we're going to learn how to write Bricklayer programs that can create artifacts that contain rings. So what we're going to discuss today, a couple things. First, I'd like to point out that the ring function in Bricklayer accepts 4 inputs, as opposed to the circle function that only accepted 3 inputs. So for a ring function, you have the size of the ring, the thickness of the ring, the color that the ring, the kind of Lego that the ring is going to be made out of, and the reference point or the center of the ring. So I'm going to quickly review, just remind everybody, how radius and diameters work in Bricklayer. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the thickness of a ring, how we can change the thickness and make rings thicker or thinner. And then I want to talk a little bit about integer arithmetic, just a little bit. And the reason why is there's this cool programming assignment or a thing that you can build that is kind of interesting, and it involves using a large graph, a large grid in Bricklayer Lite. And so to do that right, you have to understand a little bit about how to calculate the center of these kinds of grids. And then we'll play around a little bit. We'll write some Bricklayer programs that use rings. And then I'll finish by showing you some examples of cool things that you can do with rings. All right, so in Bricklayer, remember points have size. In fact, a cell is a point, so it has size 1. And then a radius is of a circle or of a ring is the distance from the center point to the edge of the ring or the edge of the circle. And if you have 2 of these radiuses and the center point, you add those together and you get the diameter of a Bricklayer circle, or the diameter of a Bricklayer ring in this case. So in that sense, rings and circles are similar. However, rings have one more piece of information that you have to provide them, and that is the thickness of a ring. And so the way it works in Bricklayer is the thickness of a ring is a number, an integer, that tells you how far in to fill in towards the center from the outer edge of the ring. So the thickness would be here. In this case, the thickness is 1. You can see because it occupies 1 cell. And they fill in from the radius in towards the center. Here's an example of a Bricklayer ring whose thickness is 2. So one thing I would like to point out here is that the best place to count, if you see a ring and somebody asks you how thick is it, the best place to count is either on the horizontal diameter that runs through the center or the vertical one. The diagonal, because the ring is jagged, that can be a little bit variable there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. There's the basic concepts. I would like to talk now a little bit about integer arithmetic, and what integer arithmetic is arithmetic without fractions or decimal points and stuff like that. And computers absolutely love integer arithmetic. And so here's an example of the kind of problem that we're going to encounter in Bricklayer a lot, but that one encounters in other places as well. So you have this document. There's a book chapter that you're supposed to print out, and you want to print out pages 8 through 14. So the question is, if that's what you write, print out pages 8 through 14, how many pages have been printed out? And so this is a place where it's very easy to make an off by 1 error, where you get about the right number, but you missed it by 1. And so the formula here is you take the highest number of the page count, so 14, minus the lower, minus 8, and then you add 1. So that's the formula for figuring out how many pages you're printing out. So let me give you some examples of this. So if the lower number is 1, this is a special case because you have minus lower, which is minus 1 plus 1, and that cancels out. So then the answer is just upper. So that's the easy one, right? And of course, what you can also do is you can just count on your fingers if the numbers are small, right? So I could have page 1, page 2, and page 3. So I printed out 3 pages. Of course, if the lower number is 2 instead of 1, and the upper also got bumped by 1, so now we go from 4 to 2, it's also still 3 pages, right? 2, 3, 4. And similarly, if I have 5 and 3, same idea. Now, in Bricklayer, a lower number that shows up a lot is the origin, is 0. So the lower number is 0, the upper number is 2. How many cells or how many pages would you print in this case? And again, it's 3. And so for small numbers, you can always sort of just count it out on your fingers if you want. But as the numbers get bigger, it starts becoming easier to actually use the formula. So here's one where the upper limit is the upper page count is 12 and the lower is 7. So how many pages am I printing out now? And you could imagine if I gave you a number like 342 and 221, right? You wouldn't want to count that out on your fingers. All right, so there's that idea, right, of how to count how many pages are in a certain range, but related to that also is how many cells in Bricklayer are in a certain range. Okay, so one thing that I'd like to talk about now is integer division. And basically, you divide one integer by another, and the answer is called a quotient, and what's left over is called the remainder. So let me give you some examples of this. In Bricklayer, the division operator, the integer division operator is div. So the expression here is 2 div 2, so that's an integer division, and the quotient, the answer is 1, and the remainder is 0. 3 div 2, in this case, the quotient is also still 1, but now we have a remainder of 1. And if I do 4 div 2, my quotient is 2. The remainder goes back down to 0 again. And if I do 5 div 2, quotient is also still 2, and the remainder goes up to 1. So if you look at the column of the quotients, it's 1, 1, 2, 2, and so on. And if you look at the column of the remainders, the pattern is 0, 1, 0, 1. So you could imagine if I went on these examples and did 6 div 2, 7 div 2, and so on, what these numbers would be. All right, so 6 div 2 we get 3 with a remainder of 0, and 7 div 2 was going to be also 3, but this time with a remainder of 1. Now you can also sort of play around with remainders, or at least visually look at them in Bricklayer. And so what you have here is an artifact where if you go to a colored cell, the z value of that cell represents the integer division of the x value by 2. So 0 div 2 is 0, and then 1 div 2 is also 0, 2 div 2 is 1, 3 div 2 is also 1, 4 div 2 is 2. So if you notice what's going on here, it's a step function. It's sort of, in some sense, kind of counting by 2. Now, of course, if I change the div from 2 to 3, I get a similar kind of a pattern here. And likewise, if I change it from, if I do a division by 4, an integer division by 4, I get just a larger step, right? Okay. So that gets us to the point now where we can talk about calculating the midpoint, the center of a grid. Now here's a grid that's a 3 by 3 grid. And so we can just kind of brute force this, right? We just look at it, and the center is, what's the coordinate? Center is right here. The coordinate of that is 1, 1. If we were going to apply this formula, we would take the upper coordinate minus the lower coordinate, and then add 1. So the upper here is 2, the lower is 0. We plug that in for upper and lower. So our size is 2 minus 0 plus 1, which is 3. And now if we want to do the midpoint of that, we're going to do an integer division. So we do size divided by 2, div 2. We plug in, since size, in this case size is 3, so we plug in the number 3, the integer 3 for size. So we get 3 div 2, and we do some math, and the answer is 1. So what that means is it's 1, 1, 1 is the coordinate of the center of this grid. Okay, so we can do something similar for other size grids. So here's a grid that has coordinates in the range of 0 to 3 in the x-axis and also in the z-axis. And this one has no exact center if the exact center has to be a cell. And so in this case, if we were going to work with a grid like this and we wanted to have the center of this grid be the center of a ring, we would have to have an approximate center. So an approximate center, there's 4 choices here: 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, or 2, 2. And any of those will work pretty much just as well as any of the other ones. Now, if we get to 5, if we get to a grid whose width is 5 and whose height is 5, so we have coordinates in the range from 0 to 4, then we're back to this odd number of cells, and those divide. That'll work out. We'll have an exact center here. So again, we apply our formula here: upper minus lower plus 1. In this case, upper is 4, lower is again 0. So we have 4 minus 0 plus 1. And so the size is 5, and the center then is going to be size div 2, which in this case is 5 div 2. And so the center is 2. Okay. Now, for all the ones that we've looked at so far, you really don't need to do math. You can just sort of count it out. But there's this, as the grids get bigger, the counting is not as fun anymore. It becomes a little bit tedious maybe. And then calculating the stuff is much easier. So there's a ring assignment or a ring artifact that I hope some of you will create, where you just have a bunch of nested rings. And what we want to do with that is we want to start in the center of a grid. And if we're going to use Bricklayer Lite, then we're kind of limited on the size of our grids. In fact, our grid choices are things like 4, 4, or 8, 8, 16, 16, 32, 32, or 64, 64. So here we are. This is a grid that has a width of 64 cells and a height of 64 cells. So now we want to calculate an approximate center for this grid. It's not going to be an exact center. All right, we're almost ready to do some coding. A couple of things that I'd just like to mention before we do that. Again, our reference point, when we pass a coordinate to a put function, that coordinate that we pass is the lower left corner of where this rectangle is going to be created by the put function. If we have a circle, the reference point for that circle is the center. And similarly, if we have a ring, the reference point for that ring is also the center. So summarizing then, right, to place a rectangle, you need to figure out the coordinate of its lower left corner. And to place a ring or a circle, you need to figure out the coordinate of its center. So let's do some Bricklayer Lite coding now.